So this is the Prostate Cancer Lab, and we're honored to have Deven McGraw today with us, and she's going to be talking about stuff around data. But first, we always do our disclaimers and let everyone know that this is not medical advice. If you have issues, you should be consulting your medical team. And the second thing is that everything that will be said here will be made public. And so if you're concerned about things you might say that might be made public, don't speak. And if you want to be anonymous, because there will be a video recording of the Zoom session, turn off your camera and put up some obscure name so you can remain anonymous. With that, I'll turn it over to Deven. I just want to do a quick setup and why I thought it would be really interesting for Deven to lead a discussion with us. I've known Deven for a while from her pioneering work when she was at Ciitizen. She's a lawyer by training, so she's an expert in health data. And we, as advanced prostate cancer patients, although I'm a lymphoma survivor, not an advanced prostate cancer patient, but let's say as advanced cancer patients are interested in using their data to help them make clinical decisions. And so the aspect that we're interested in is what should we be thinking about in terms of accessing and sharing our data so we can get better insights. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deven.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Brad. I'm very glad to be here. Let me pull up some slides. Hopefully you can see them. Let me get them on the ability. Where's the slideshow view?
Down at the bottom, the thing that looks like a, there you go. Well, to the right there. One more to the right, that one.
That one?
Yep.
All right.
That should do it.
Super, it does. And I normally use the bar at the top, which is sometimes it's hard to see on Zoom because there's other stuff that's blocking it. So thank you very much. I am the lead for data stewardship and data sharing for the Ciitizen platform. And actually I need to update that because when Ciitizen got acquired by Invitae, I got a bigger job. Invitae is a clinical genetic testing company. Ciitizen is a platform that helps patients to leverage their rights under federal law, at least here in the US, to get access to all of their health information so that they have it at their fingertips and can use it as they wish and share it as they wish, whether it's for involving a caregiver or seeking treatment options or contributing data to research or all of those things. I was formerly with the HHS Office for Civil Rights, which is the all things HIPAA. So policy and enforcement of the HIPAA privacy and security and breach notification laws. And it also did a stint as the acting chief privacy officer at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which sets the standards for electronic medical records and more recently policies around some new laws called the Information Blocking or Cures Act regulations. So I have the same caveat that Brad started with, which is that I'm going to give you a presentation about the laws and policies that facilitate patient access to their data, but I'm not your lawyer and I cannot give you legal advice. And that's really about the application of law to a particular set of factual circumstances so that you understand how you might be in compliance. This will help you, I think, understand the parameters of the law, but I can't be your lawyer or somebody will get me into trouble as much as I would like to. So with that, I always start with a bit of the value proposition for patients. I feel like for this crowd, I don't really need to do that. I think you all are pretty well convinced, but the ability of patients to seek treatment options for themselves, including clinical trials. You can't know if you match to a clinical trial without your data. Being able to support clinical research, keeping others informed of what's going on with your care so that they can be helpers to you. And then, of course, care coordination. This is an infographic that comes right from the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. We've been talking a lot lately about the rights of patients to get their data, and there's, some of the discussion, the tone of it makes you think, oh, this is a new thing, that the Cures Act established new rights. And the reality is that it didn't actually. The HIPAA privacy laws, which were kind of finalized and put into effect for most entities covered by the law in 2001, so well over 2 decades ago, established the right of individuals to access to and a copy of their identifiable health information, which is otherwise known as protected health information, or PHI, under the law. Now, despite this right, we know from literature and probably a lot of you from personal experience that this is not easy to exercise, that there's a lot of obstacles oftentimes to getting these records. Sometimes, you know, you've had organizations, I have heard stories of organizations outright telling people, HIPAA won't let you get a copy of your data, when in fact the opposite is true. But even if someone is granting you this right, sometimes the barriers to getting that right can be pretty significant, and the scope of the right is actually really broad. I helped to write some guidance when I was at the Office for Civil Rights to try to clarify that this right has a lot of parameters to it that are favorable to the patient. You can't make a patient come in person to get their data. They have to have some way of getting it remotely. You need to provide it to the patient in the form or format that they request, as long as it's technically capable of providing that to them. HIPAA provides for 30 days. They can take up to 30 days and can extend for an additional 30 days if they have to go off-site, for example, to get your information. In a minute, we'll talk about how the information blocking rules improve on those timeframes. And then HIPAA does allow for fees to be charged, but they're supposed to be reasonable and cost-based, and not necessarily per page if what you're getting is digital copies of a digital document. This is another area where we see a lot of friction, where patients are given bills for, you know, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for access to their health information. More than likely, those fees, unless they really are really old paper records for which a per page fee can be charged, usually the costs are higher than they should be when they're imposed. Sometimes organizations give them for free to patients, but I do see charges from time to time. So we're moving beyond HIPAA, and I would say somewhat rapidly moving beyond HIPAA to you know, sort of greater facilitation with data, including the ability to get that data through a completely online experience, such as through an app. You know, I don't think we're moving quickly enough, but we definitely have made a lot of progress in the last 2 to 5 years on accessibility of kind of a core set of health information for patients. It's not nearly in the volume that's as impactful for cancer patients in particular, because the volume of data that they produce, that's produced about them in a clinical visit is pretty voluminous. And oftentimes not always available through an online kind of portal. But that situation should in fact improve over the coming years because of some other federal initiatives that I'm going to talk about next. So HIPAA is no longer the only set of federal policies that lean very heavily towards favoring patient access. There are now payment incentives under Medicare and Medicaid for clinicians to make data accessible to patients. There are certification requirements in the electronic health record tools that many clinicians utilize that provide capabilities to make data more available to patients, such as through application programming interfaces that are open and standard in accordance with the FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource, for those of you who don't know. And those capabilities have, you know, for the past couple of years have been more widely adopted in the customer base for these EMR vendors. There are also new information blocking requirements that came out of the Cures Act. We're going to go into a little bit of detail on those. So let's go ahead and do that. So the information blocking rules, otherwise known as the Cures Act rules, play a really important role, or will play an important role. They're still kind of nascent. They haven't been fully. I'm not sure, is someone interrupting me or just forgetting to mute? I think forgetting to mute. Now, what are these information blocking rules? What do they say? They went into effect April 5th, 2021. They're not yet being enforced yet. But we do know that the Office of the National Coordinator has received a lot of complaints, particularly about healthcare providers not complying with the information blocking rules for patient access. They create this presumption that an entity covered by the rules must share electronic health information, doesn't apply to paper, for any lawful purpose. And as I just explained to you, providing access to patients is not just a lawful purpose, it is a required purpose under HIPAA. So there's an emphasis in the information blocking rules on making sure that patients can access their data, even though these rules don't just apply to patient access. It applies to healthcare providers and certified electronic health record vendors like Epic and Cerner, and these entities called health information exchanges, which exist across the country in states and sometimes with bordering state regional exchanges. They have typically exchanged information among medical providers for treatment purposes, but they are beginning to open up for other purposes because the information blocking rules put pressure on them to do so. There are penalties associated with blocking. You can be fined up to $1 million if you are an electronic record vendor or an HIE and you've been found to be information blocking. Medical providers are going to be referred to CMS for appropriate disincentives. We don't know what those look like yet. We're anticipating a proposed rule to come out of the Office of the National Coordinator actually to propose those disincentives. So it'll probably be at least another year, probably a bit more before those get finalized. There are kind of exceptions, safe harbor exceptions that an entity covered by these information blocking rules can rely on if they decline to share data or otherwise make sharing data more difficult. They're not easy to meet, though. It's not like a healthcare provider, for example, can say, oh, I decided not to share with the patient for privacy reasons. They can't just generally say that. They have to really document with some specificity why they decline to provide access to a patient. And because HIPAA already requires these entities to provide data to patients, that would be a hard case to make unless, for example, they had some sort of policy that they had newly implemented requiring additional patient consent. Now, again, this is patients getting their own records, so that policy would have to be judged about whether it placed additional burdens on patients. But suffice it to say that there are some exceptions that were designed to protect legitimate behaviors around data sharing that are important to preserve. But they have standards that have to be met before they apply. It's not like an entity can just decide, oh, I'm withholding this data or placing additional obstacles to sharing it because of privacy, and I decide the parameters of what that means. If you're going to make a judgment call and not make information easy to share with the patient, you better have a darn good reason and document that. So let's see. Oh, sorry about that. So we do have an environment now where patients are increasingly getting greater power in terms of accessing their data. I referenced the HIPAA right of access earlier. It for a long time, notwithstanding the guidance that made it more clear just how broad and this right is and greater expectations on entities for complying with it. It wasn't really enforced very robustly, but over the last 3 to 4 years, it has been. And that, I think, has improved data sharing immensely. It doesn't mean there aren't pockets of areas where there's still non-compliance, but it's in better shape than it was 5 or 6 years ago. And again, the information blocking rules prioritize access by patients or applications acting on their behalf, like a Ciitizen app or Apple's Health app, to just provide 2 examples. The information blocking rules do set an expectation that it wouldn't take 30 days to produce a digital copy for patients. There are not sort of specific timeframes necessarily, other than some guidance out of the Office of the National Coordinator, basically saying that with respect to patient portals, if the lab result is available to the ordering clinician, then it needs to be available to the patient if the patient wants to see those results without any delay. And you all may be aware of a lot of discussion about this because there are some members of the medical community, the professional societies in particular, that are opposed to this. They want a delay. They're not asking for 30 days. They're typically asking for 48 to 72 hours. And as a consequence of this dispute and the federal agencies kind of standing firm with the patient's right to get that data right away, we're seeing some state activity to require labs and medical professionals in that state to impose a delay before getting results to patients. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. Again, because the certified electronic medical records now have to have this functionality that can enable patients to kind of plug in and get their data more easily, there is this, there's a lot of federal policy that's aiming at that pathway as the pathway for getting data, but it's really up to the patient. The patient does not have to use a portal to get their data if they don't want to. They also can prefer to use the portal as the mechanism to get their data, as long as the data is of the type that can be accessible through that portal, which is not all data at this point. Image files, for example, are typically not available through that mechanism yet. Some providers have done the work to do that, but not all. What's coming up to get excited about? Well, HIPAA, notwithstanding the information blocking rules, not every entity covered by the info blocking rules, not every entity, covered by HIPAA is also covered by information blocking rules. Health plans, for example, are not subject to the information blocking rules, and so they're still subject to HIPAA and CMS rules if they're regulated by CMS. So there are some proposed changes to the HIPAA privacy rule that would kind of raise the bar on the baseline that HIPAA establishes for right of access, including expressly prohibiting certain unreasonable measures and a 15-day time frame for responding to access requests. We're not sure when those are going to get finalized. I expect this year, but and early this year is when they've projected it, but they almost never meet their deadlines, so it's kind of hard to say. There's also this thing called the TEFCA, which is the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. This is a voluntary network designed to facilitate the nationwide exchange of digital health information. It kind of builds on these health information exchanges that I was talking about earlier that exist throughout the country and largely just facilitate exchange for treatment. A number of the others picked up public health use cases during the pandemic. Some of them also exchange with payers. But the idea is to assure that they can connect to one another nationwide for a broader range of purposes, including the ability of patients to essentially have a query launched through this network and get data returned. So rather than having to go to each portal of their doctor, if their doctors participate in this TEFCA or the doctor's medical record networks participate in TEFCA, the idea is a single on-ramp and then data from all of those sites being able to be delivered. And here's a diagram of sort of what this is supposed to look like. There's a coordinating entity at the top. That's the Sequoia project. And then there are these anchors for this nationwide network that are called QHINs, or Qualified Health Information Networks. And then participants are expected to just have a way to launch a query through one of these QHINs, and then the QHINs all connect to one another and can facilitate the exchange of data. So I'm going to stop sharing. I've just unloaded a lot of information on you all. And I think I'm going to open myself up to dialogue and questions, because I suspect for many of you knew a fair bit about this. Others, maybe some of this might be new, and happy to have a discussion or answer any questions. Overall, it's kind of an exciting time for patient empowerment movement. At the same time, we sort of see where the puck is going, and it's looking good, and it's taken way too long to get there. And so the fact that we don't have everything that is on the horizon as tools that we can use today is a bit frustrating, and there are still some entities pushing back hard. on this and trying to make this hard for patients to exercise. And we can talk about some of the obstacles that we're seeing as well.
I'll selfishly jump in with the first question while others may be formulating theirs, and then they can raise their hand, and we'll use that feature to call on people with questions. Deven, the patients we have are very aggressive in getting diagnostic information. And so rather than, they're already like moved beyond, I can get access to my medical records, that's assumed. What's interesting is I go to Foundation Medicine or I go to Tempus and I get, very whole genome raw sequencing files. And so it's a very big file. It's never going to sit in the medical record because the medical record can't handle anything that big. So I don't get it there. I have to go to Tempus or Foundation Medicine to get access to that. Is there any, do these HIPAA rules and the patient access, do they apply in that sphere for these kinds of data?
They do. They do. In fact, we were very clear when I was at the Office for Civil Rights that, well, first of all, laboratories, clinical laboratories are subject to the HIPAA right of access, as long as they are laboratories that bill for the delivery of laboratory services to some degree. They are covered. So Invitae, whom I work for, is covered, Myriad, Color, the only labs that might not be covered by this would be if they're solely direct to consumer. But I think most of the labs that would have the type of sort of clinical, high value clinical raw data files that you're looking for would be covered by the HIPAA rules and covered as medical providers under the information blocking rules. And we also made clear in guidance that the right of the patient to get data extended beyond the laboratory, beyond just the test report itself, but to the underlying files that created the data, that the patient has the right to all information in what's called a designated record set, which is not just information in the technical medical record, however that gets defined by a particular institution, but any other information that might exist that the entity generates or collects that is of the type used to make decisions about patients. And so the idea is that the underlying raw data files are utilized to generate the report, which is a decision about a patient. And so you have the right to that underlying data. Now, of course, it's probably never going to be available in a portal because the files are so large, and there's a negotiation that happens around the format in which these files can be delivered to you because they are so large. But that's supposed to be a negotiation with you so that you're getting it in a way that works for you and that can be actually produced by the entity. So I know there is a specific FAQ on OCR's website on this topic, and I'd be happy to provide you with the direct link to that because I was there when we drafted it.
That's very cool. And that really does play, because we sometimes go hat in hand sort of begging for that information. And I guess there's a couple of related things. Sometimes like Foundation Medicine, I think, was collecting data that they didn't tell patients they were collecting. So there's stuff like that can happen.
Right.
And anyway, so there's that kind of stuff. There's a related one, and actually Rick, maybe I should cue Rick about this, but Rick was very interested in getting access to novel tests like spatial analysis or something that was research use only tests, but are typically not given to patients, and because they're not meant for clinical guidance. That's what research use only means. But Rick was able, through the help of Nick Shork, to get an IRB that would allow him to see his data. So Rick, maybe you can set that up for Deven, but I'm sort of curious. Again, I'm pushing the limits of patient access, but this is one where it's almost the diagnostic company is saying, I can't release this to you because it's for research use only.
Yeah.
Rick, did you want to add some color to that?
Yeah, I would love to hear about Rick's experience. That one is one where you'll have to go hat in hand because it's not clear to me that the law, you could use the law as a crowbar because it's not designated record set information if it's research only.
Yeah. Yeah. The spatial companies were so promising, but then they really dug in their feet when it came to research use only. So they wouldn't even run the data, let alone there was no access because there was no data. They wouldn't work on my tissue. So that was very disappointing. We were all hoping for immune oncology insights that might open those immune oncology doors that are pretty shut for us prostate cancer patients in general. So that was a big frustration. I was just at the end, just trying to open the door, even if it was old tissue, just give me a report, let me see what you could do, but it didn't happen. Let me shift, if there's no questions on that, to another. Okay, thanks, Brad, I saw that. So Tempus produces RNA-seq data, to my awareness, on everyone they do genomics sequencing on, but it's typically not even mentioned, or it may be mentioned, but it's not provided to patients typically. And it seems like that is an opportunity to get more clarity and help, because the average patient, it goes into the doctor's office at some comprehensive cancer center and they get sequencing. It might be a number of shops, and one of them might be Tempus, might be another one. I don't know the standard procedures of other companies, but Tempus, to my awareness, runs RNA-seq on everyone and just doesn't provide that data, just, you know, kind of part of their collection. And someday that'll be a treasure trove, hopefully of statistical value. But patients don't get that typically, and it's not a large file, so it can be percolated down into RNA reads per million, transcripts per million, which is like, you know, 80 kilobytes of data for 20,000 rows, a few columns. So I would like to see that be more transparent and just everyone get their data, rather than some kind of hand wave, oh, it's too big, or you know, it's not actionable. That's another thing. What is actionable yesterday is not does not define actionable today as we're pushing forward. So my oncologist once, well, I'll leave out a name because I have like 6, so you won't know which one, but what are we going to do with that data? Like, why do you care? And my response would be, you know, I'm looking for therapeutic opportunities that I wouldn't see just from the genomics, but from gene expression. But is it actionable? Do they have to release it? Because not really actionable, according to many people. So I invite you to add any response to that situation that you wish.
Yeah, so the size of the file is really mostly only relevant to how it ends up getting produced for you. The most relevant question is whether that RNA-seq data that Tempus is supposedly generating, I'm saying supposedly because I don't have any insider knowledge of Tempus's practices, but if they're generating it on each and every test or some sort of segment of tests, if you can get some evidence of why they do this and what they use that data for, and then figure out if an argument can be made that it's designated record set data. Like if they're just generating it as a kind of for something that has nothing to do with test interpretation, then it's going to be harder to argue that it's designated record set data. So even though it was generated off of your test, it still has to meet that definition in order to be subject to both the Cures Act rules and the HIPAA rules regarding whether you could, again, use the law as a crowbar to access it, as opposed to making a passion plea to these entities. The
Well,
other thing I'll note is that nobody has to produce data for you that they're not already producing as part of the, what information blocking and HIPAA gives you is a retrospective right to what they've created that meets the designated record set definition. And then it also applies only to data and not to specimens. So you alluded earlier to some, a desire to have them run some test on specimens that they preserved from you. And that would, it's unfortunate that that specimen, that these rules apply only to data. And in fact, the biospecimen is not going to be accessible by you, nor can you use the law again as a way to sort of force them to generate data that they haven't already generated. If they've generated the data, then it gets to, why did you generate that data? And can I make a plausible argument that it's subject to these rules? If that makes any sense. So it's not perfect in terms of getting you everything that you would want.
So Deven, I think what these companies are doing is they're selling their data to big pharma for drug development.
Mm-hmm.
So how does HIPAA or the law come into play in terms of protecting the rights of patients? Because essentially you have a company who's profiting from patient data.
Yeah.
So,
well,
yeah.
I mean, it does not. Well, so the only way they can profit from patient data without your consent is if they've de-identified it in accordance with HIPAA standards. And we could have a lot of conversation about, sort of how that fits in. Once they've de-identified it, then there are sale of data requirements in HIPAA that would require you to authorize that, but it would have to be, they'd have to be selling your identifiable information versus information that is met HIPAA's de-identification standards, which does not require anonymity, just requires reduction of risk to very low risk of re-identification. So that's that piece. But even if they're selling HIPAA de-identified data, if it meets designated record set definition, it's yours, regardless of whether that might impinge on their market opportunities to sell the data, license the data, however they do that. You can still get your copy, and their proprietary interest in that data is secondary to your ability to access it, but only where the categories of data that meet the designated record set definition. So all of this other data that might be being generated, that is research data only, that is never used for clinical decision making or laboratory result generation, is going to be harder for you all to get, even though it might be subject to being monetized by the company. But again, keep in mind the fact that there is a commercial data enterprise operated by this company does not mean that your right of access takes a back seat. That is not a reason to deny you the ability to access that information. So it's really like, how much evidence can you generate that some of this data that you've been seeking, that you've been denied, is in fact used by the company to make clinical decisions? How creative can you be at fashioning an argument that, yeah, the company might be using it for a bunch of other stuff, but they also use it to improve their clinical reads of the test?
Yeah. So I'll just tell you, we have very close ties to Tempus.
Yeah.
They're incredibly supportive of what we do. They have a whole AWS, infrastructure that, patients can access directly, where all of the raw, FASTQ files are available, so that we can then take them in and actually, in certain cases, work with their bioinformaticians to kind of figure out, custom analyses for us. So they're very good about that. I wanted to say that so that I didn't disparage Tempus, because they've been truly amazing for me.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I think they were to Ciitizen too before we got acquired by Invitae. We actually have a patient record scorecard where we have documented how easy it is to access data from more than 6,000 providers, including labs, in my recollection, because I helped to stand up that unit in early days. Tempus was great. Invitae was great. Some others not so great.
Yeah. Let me push this story back a little bit. I'm sure folks on this call are going to know where I'm going to go with this, but a lot of this data is generated from tissue or blood samples or whatever, right? Well, let's just take tissue because that's easy. Tissue goes into a biobank, literally referred to as a biobank in my healthcare institution. Well, the odd thing is that I really don't have full control over that biobank. I don't know how much money I have. I would call it, it's like tissue is like digital currency in the biobank. I don't know how much currency I actually have. I got some guesses. I want to be able to maximize the utility of it. I can request certain, tests, of course, but sometimes that's a real hassle. Actually, I've got to, convince my doctor to do proteomics, for example. Finally, she's on board, right? But where does HIPAA come into play relative to a patient's rights to their tissue and how that information zero?
When I first joined the Office for Civil Rights, I remember the senior policy advisor who had been with the organization almost since HIPAA was first drafted. She'd been there for a very long time, very deep knowledge. She said, we don't do parts, we just do data. So if there's data written about your specimen and it fits into this designated record set definition, data that's used to make decisions about patients, then it's subject to the right of access. But the tissue itself is not data, and so therefore is not covered by those rules. And I have been in many meetings where there's been, we need a patient movement. We need Congress to, sort of do something very similar to establish a patient right to access biospecimens, but I've never seen any real movement on it. So
that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. For us, we spent a lot of time on it, figuring out that that's the source for the data. Like if you don't have the tissue, you don't have data. So
yeah, makes you want to bring in an extra little container to the time when they extract and say, please give me my little piece for me.
Richard has a question.
Well, just riffing on that, if one could persuade a clinician to do a test, once they've done the test, they've opened the door and now a patient would have access to the data. Is that right?
Well, it might be a little bit tricky. So first of all, if you've persuaded that clinician to do the test, I can't imagine why they would do the test and not give you the results of it, because why else would they have done the test? But if you do face a situation where somebody does a test at your request, but then, maybe their legal department steps in and says, we shouldn't give this to the patient. It was not generated to make clinical decisions about that patient. It was generated because the patient asked for it. And yet it doesn't meet the definition of a designated record set because it's information that they generate that they use to make decisions about you. So I could see a circumstance where they may tell you, no, we're not going to do it, even though they never would have performed the test in the first place, but for your request. I mean, it would be weird, but if they're not generating it as a clinical function for them to make decisions about you, then it becomes harder for you to argue that you have a legal right to it because it hasn't necessarily fit into the designated record set definition. If they bill for that test, it's probably what we call in legal speak prima facie evidence that they wanted to use it for clinical decision making because they billed for it. that I realize it's kind of an incomplete answer. It seems very odd to me that any clinical setting would run a test at your request and then suddenly deny you the results of that. But if they didn't have a clinical reason for generating the test, and or they have no intent or desire, or don't actually in practice ever use that to make a clinical decision about you, you might run into some obstacles in arguing that it's designated record set definition. That the real key to sort of using these laws that I've talked about as the crowbar to get data out and in your hands, and data only, unfortunately, not specimens, is it in the medical record, or is it somewhere else on the premises of that facility or with a contractor? And it's the data that's of the type to make medical decisions about patients that they use to make medical decisions.
So obviously it's a bit of an unsettled area. And I guess, the penalties for failure to comply, I mean, like, the penalties for failure to comply with copyright are in theory extraordinarily high, but in practice, no one ever pays the, per occurrence, $50,000 or whatever. So, but the penalties are pretty high. So, and presumably the organization wants to work with the clinician. So it's not a whopping crowbar, but it's not, it might be a big screwdriver or something. But I guess it also sort of splits into probably at least two cases, one of which is that maybe it's done at the hospital lab. And the other is when it's done, where a clinician, I mean, I'm not saying that the patient has persuaded the clinician. I mean, they have, but the clinician has to go along with it. So I think the argument of whether that it's the patient's request is sort of vanished into the ether. The clinician made the request, presumably because somehow they were convinced that it's for the benefit of decision-making.
Yeah.
And once they go to a lab, maybe all they need to do, maybe the magic word is to tell the lab, I'm trying to make a clinical decision. Could you do this test for me? They do the tests, whether it's a hospital lab or an off-premises lab. Once they do the test and the clinician uses those magic words, maybe they have a pretty good lever to argue that they should get the data. It sounds like you agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's something anyway. It's not the full on.
I mean, I think it's probably in most cases a presumption that if it was a test ordered from a clinical laboratory for a patient, it is clinical data, and absent a research only type of relationship between the provider and the lab, or the provider saying to the lab, this was generated in a research context only, and the patients aren't supposed to have access to it, which, by the way, brings me to another point. So sometimes the data are generated in kind of what I would call a mixed purpose type of environment, right? It's both used for research, but it's also being used in your clinical care. And what HIPAA says about that, and it's applicable to the information blocking rules too, is that you might not be able to get a copy of the result that was used that's being actively used in research if it would bias the research for you to see those results, like you're in a blinded type of protocol or something, right? But it's not an infinite bar to your access to those results. It's access for the pendency of the research, and then you're supposed to be able to get it. And it only applies if the research, if it's required to, in order to not bias the research. It's not sort of like again, when you have a mixed clinical and research kind of purpose that's going on, it's being used.
Also, you have access to clinical trial data too, at least some clinical trial data. I mean, I guess the big issue is whether getting the data would unblind the results.
Yeah.
I mean, you certainly don't get PK data probably, because that would tell you there's a drug in there, but you might get genomic expression data, because that could be the course of the disease or course of standard of care, or it could be the new treatment. So you might have a good argument to get a lot of the clinical trial record data as well. It sounds like there are lawyers who, I mean, you don't want to get a lawyer involved, but it sounds like there are ways to, it sounds like you can get an awful lot. Well, one other quick question on that front. I know that, a lot of institutions don't have image data, but if you call them up, can you get an image file?
Yeah, absolutely. Ciitizen has been collecting image files for its cancer patients since our inception. We usually have to go to the radiology department to get it. And on occasion, especially when we were early days, I would sometimes have to get on the phone with privacy and compliance officers and say, you know, the image files are definitely part of the designated record set because you don't generate them except in clinical context, again, absent a certainly purely research protocol reason. And it's a common myth among facilities or the vendors, the business vendors that they often use to process information requests, that, oh, images are not included. Oh, yes, they are. And in fact, the guidance says so quite specifically. We've also done this for EEG tracings for our rare, we have patients on the Ciitizen platform with rare neurological disorders. And, you know, we were getting EEG reports, and then there was a value proposition to getting those underlying tracings that were generated, and we do get them.
They'll scan them or something.
Yeah, it took a bit of discussion, and we usually have to work directly with a small cadre of vendors who serve that space, but they do it. So.
And you have access to the clinical trial data at the conclusion of the trial.
You should, yes.
Well, that's really, really interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let me just ask a question of switching from access to sharing a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I've always loved the value proposition of patients like me, you know, that I could go look and see other patients who fit my profile, and 10 tried this drug and it worked, and 10 tried something else and it didn't work, you know, whatever that might be. But there are no, to my knowledge, well, I guess I can think of one or two, maybe, observational registries where a patient could donate data, but also then get access to other patients' data for clinical use, for clinical guides, and not for research. Right. So there's Count Me In, there's All of Us, there's lots of things that are, you donate, as a patient, you donate your data for research, but typically patients get no feedback. You get no value, no benefit often from donating your data. It's because it's being used for research purposes. What are you seeing, and what's going on in the frontier that would be of interest to us, where I could maybe put my data into a pool, but then see other patients' data and use it for insights to guide my testing and treatment?
Yeah, I have not seen that model yet. I mean, we operate, and I know we're not the only ones who do this. We do operate a model that allows for patients to contribute their Ciitizen data, which they also have their own copy of, but to contribute a copy to a registry, a disease-based registry that is designed to facilitate research. You know, usually we'll do this in conjunction with a particular advocacy group. And, you know, we give patients the ability to share data with the advocacy group, whether it's just contact information or detailed clinical information. The step we haven't taken yet, but that is very intriguing, and that we'd love to pursue, is the idea that patients could essentially opt into a social type of sharing of all of their data and all of their accounts. I mean, at a minimum, you could all join the same personal health record platform, get all your data, and then provision access by each person in your group to enable you to see that data, or organize yourself in a way that, you know, you've sort of got a registry that's being contributed to, and part of the terms of the registry are that, you know, any patient who actively contributes to the registry can also see the registry for their own clinical, or maybe they're doing community scientist type of research on that data. So there may be models out there that I just haven't come across yet. You know, I've seen a lot where patients, because it's coming out of these personal health record platforms, you get all your data and it gets contributed to research, but you still have access to it. But I haven't quite yet seen the sort of next level dive of, oh, and you can join this community and not just share like in kind of a social group setting where you're talking about your symptoms, but go allow somebody else to dive deeply into your clinical data if you want, if you allow it.
Just to put a pin on that for future reference, Deven, we are doing that now in our community.
Great.
And Brian just did a report out from that a week ago, and so we have a Google Drive file where everybody donates their data. All the patients can see each other's, and then Brian did some aggregated analysis on that data to say, here are the patterns around biomarkers that seem to be prevalent, or these sorts of things. And he added some interesting data to it. So anyway, we're very interested in that, as you can imagine, patients would be. And if you ever run into that in the future, we'd be interested in collaborating with a group that would be doing that. The one that I've heard of that's along those lines is XCures, which is part of Cancer Commons, or has an Excelsior observational registry that's tracking people longitudinally. So they've tried to set that up. It's the one instance I've seen.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, the closest that we have come to date that I know of is allowing people to allow an advocacy group of their choice to be able to look at that data and generate statistics out of it. But that's a different layer than inviting a community of people to all do their own statistical analysis.
Yeah, I think that happens in rare diseases too, because there are people that are tight knit and passionate, and will do that sort of thing. Yeah.
That in the rare space is mostly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. We're approaching the hour. Any other questions for Deven? This has been great. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll get you the link to that guidance around the ability to access the underlying files, because it's kind of buried in an FAQ and might be hard for people to find who don't know exactly where it is. So I'll get you that link and the link to the clarification that it includes images as well. So that should be helpful. Won't help you get specimens, but will help you get underlying files, hopefully.
Thank you. Rick has another question.
Yeah, real quick. It's very interesting about the images, and I had IHC stain done on my tumor, my primary tumor. And per request, I wanted to know if I had any evidence of tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, which might open up the possibility for immunotherapy. So I asked that of City of Hope, and I got my test result was in these words: 0 to 5% TILs, period. And I was like, well, is there any images? Could I look at the images? I mean, I kind of know images a little bit. And no, we don't take any images, was their response. We don't take any images. Just the pathologist looked at it. No images, 0 to 5, you're done. So that was not satisfying. Is there anything that I could have done, requested? I mean, it's not like I went in and knew, oh, there won't be any images. I kind of expected that. There, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, maybe because you asked for images specifically, like instead maybe broaden the request a little bit, like, please give me the underlying data that informed this result.
It was the pathologist eye.
Pathologist eye. Yeah. This is reminding me a bit of a patient that I spoke to whose son had some sort of surgery that on his arm that involved that was done like only you would think through images, like the surgeons looking at the image, guiding the equipment in, doing the fix, and then getting out. You would think that a history of medical care would include images taken of the steps in that process in order to document that the surgery was done correctly. Well, he had a very bad result. As a teenager, he now basically has he has a disability in his arm that probably will never go away. And when she asked for the images that were generated during the surgery, they said they didn't generate any. And that is a real problem when you're trying to get records, because you just have this sense, how could that possibly be good medical care if there wasn't documentation along the way of what was done? But the unfortunate part is that the HIPAA rules, again, are retrospective in application. It only applies where you actually generated the documentation. And it becomes this sort of, well, how could you not have generated documentation? But if they say they didn't generate the documentation, then Like, she was going to the Department of Health in the state where she lived and going, how is it not malpractice to not generate documentation around this particular, procedure? But ultimately you get the finger pointing. It's their fault. It's their fault. Like, anyway, it's not a great answer. I always say, sometimes it's better to make friends than to use the legal screwdriver or crowbar, because you might get a little bit less resistance, but they sometimes find creative ways to tell you no. And this was either their way of telling you that, of not giving you something that they had, but they figured out an excuse, or it just doesn't exist, versus,
doesn't every modern pathology department make an image to send? I mean, are they? No.
Oh, no. It's under 20%, I think, that actually get digitized.
One thing though that, and this is maybe another sort of wrinkle question, a lot of like Sloan Kettering got in a huge amount of trouble because they started a company that was using their image slide file. So I imagine a lot of research institutions are trying to access and sell their slide data, and they probably are doing it by scanning it. What if they scan this file for some other purpose? Now they have the image. Is there a way to use that to get back to the image? Say, well, if you're ever going to sell this slide for anybody, you better make sure you give it to me.
Well, I mean, it's always about like, how long do they keep it, right? So it's like whether they make a picture of an image, or like, look, if they made an image and they kept that image, arguably you have the right to it. If they didn't keep the image, but they made a copy of the image, then you have a right to that copy as long as they've kept it. Because that's also a tricky part, is sometimes this stuff disappears.
But I mean, I think that a lot of these institutions do it because they want to monetize it. So they think that they can make a new file and sell it to a pathology AI company or something. And if they ever want to be able to do that, you can keep asking them, and then, they may already be doing it because one side of the institution doesn't know that the other side is actually spun off an AI company.
Yeah, if the proprietary interest of the company in monetizing that data is not a barrier to your getting it, as long as it meets designated record set definition. So the fact that they have a secondary purpose for it does not obliterate how it was generated, and that it was generated for a clinical purpose and they kept it.
Or they created it a year later. Would that be
okay?
Or they
created it, well, if they created it a year later, then you might have trouble connecting it to the clinical purpose that generated it. If they have a bunch of files and then they generated something just for the purpose of commercialization, and it was never a file that was ever intended to be used for clinical purposes, then you're going to have some trouble doing that. I guess you could make a creative argument that what they created for the commercial purpose has, is data, the data that fed into that was data that was part of the designated record set. So you have a right to at least what informed the creation of that second commercialized document. I mean, it's how creative thinking, wherever you can attach the sort of, at some point, the underlying parts of this were used for clinical decision making, and so therefore I have a right to it. That's what you got to kind of bank on, is that.